I'm going to be talking about what amendments and fertilizers are and what's the difference. I'll introduce essential plant nutrients and how plants obtain them. And at the end of the presentation, I'll have an action plan, some very practical information for how to address amendments and fertilizers for landscape plants, annuals like vegetables and other annuals, California natives, and containers. As gardeners, our main job is to nurture conditions in the soil so that both plants and the organisms living in the soil thrive. You may have seen this slide before if you've seen some of our other presentations. We talk about soil, water, aeration, and sun as being practices that are really comprise good cultural care. And we're going to be talking about several of them this evening. I'm going to start with amendments. And I want to emphasize that amendments can modify soil properties, physical and chemical properties. Amending is adding materials to soil. So they're materials that are tilled, dug, or somehow incorporated to modify soil in a zone where the roots will grow. And what I mean when I say use the term till is that the soil is turned over mechanically with a shovel or perhaps with a rototiller. The soil is mixed in some way with the material that we're amending with. You've probably seen this pie chart before also, perhaps many times. The volume of the soil can be thought of as being split between solid materials, which are mineral particles, the tiny pieces of rock that are in the soil, and the organic material. That's the solid material. And then pore space, which is filled with either air or water. And the pore space is about half of the volume, and the solid material is the other half. So let's take a look at a profile of soil for just a moment. At the very top, there's surface litter, and that's organic material. That might be leaves and twigs, little pebbles, which are not organic, but and the next layer down is topsoil, and that layer is organic material mixed with mineral particles. And from there down, organic material is rapidly decreasing the deeper you go. And the size of the rock particles will be increasing until you get to bedrock. And this pie chart that we refer to often as master gardeners, it comes from that layer that's topsoil. And that layer is about 4 to 8 inches thick. So it might be a little bit more, it might be a little bit less, but it's in that ballpark. Soil structure is the arrangement of solid particles of soil, the little bits of rock that we refer to as minerals, into clumps. And we call those clumps aggregates. The aggregates are what allow the soil to be crumbly. Crumbly soil is very good. You want the water to go into and through the soil. Let's see here if I can grab my laser pointer. So you want the water to go into the soil, and through those pore spaces, and then to drain through and air to follow. You want the moisture to be contained on the edges of those aggregates. And when a soil has good structure, it has that 50% airspace, that space for air and water. Except for sands, soil particles don't actually exist as single particles, but as these aggregates. And you might be wondering how big those aggregates are, because they kind of look like popcorn balls, or maybe in a smaller sense like grape nuts. In fact, they're very tiny. They are ranging in size from about 1/100 of an inch to somewhat larger. So you can see them. They're not so small that you need a microscope, but they're very small. And how are they formed? Well, so the organic material that's in the soil feeds the organisms that are living in the soil. The plant and microorganism exudates, along with earthworm and insect feces, are sticky. And those exudates serve as glue to stick the particles together. And that the fact that those particles stick together forms the pore space. You can also get air in your soil by tilling. So remember, tilling is mechanically turning the soil. So you might want to do that one time to break up compacted soil if it's very compacted and you haven't gardened in that location in a while. But remember, tilling will put air into the soil certainly, but it'll also damage the life in the soil and damage the soil structure. So we recommend not tilling in order to preserve the life in the soil as much as possible. So I just talked about adding organic material to improve physical properties, but also amendments can improve chemical properties. And the most common modification that we make to chemical properties is related to soil pH. Soil pH is a measurement of how acidic or alkaline the soil is. So for example, if you're growing blueberries or rhododendrons, you might want to modify the pH of your soil to make it more acidic. And I'll talk about pH in some later slides. So where do you get amendments? You can buy all kinds of bags or bulk products at nurseries or big box stores, but buyer beware, amendments are not regulated. You can't go to a nursery and request a bag of amendment. What you'll need to do instead is understand what it is you're looking for. What are good qualities of amendments? That will depend on what it is you're trying to accomplish. Maybe you have heavy clay soil and you want to improve water drainage and water movement through the soil. Well, just as I described, adding organic material will help with the structure, and that will help improve drainage and water movement. Or maybe you have sandy soil and water tends to drain quickly through sandy soil and it may dry out quickly. In this case, you may want to improve moisture retention in the soil. And once again, organic material is an ingredient that you can amend your soil with that will help with moisture retention. So when do you add amendments? Before planting. Mix them into the top layer of the soil. And how will you know if you need amendments? Well, sorry, I'm too fast. If you amend with materials that will continue to decompose, and this could be anything you recognize, sticks, leaves, or straw, the decomposition process consumes nitrogen. So if you see little sticks here, those little sticks will draw nitrogen out of the soil when they're decomposing. So you're going to need to add nitrogen. And how will you know if you need to amend the soil? Well, touch the soil. You're looking for dark and look at it and smell it. You're looking for soil that is black or dark brown. That generally means that it's fertile. You want it to be soft enough to dig, absorb water well, and drain well. And in a perfect world, you're also going to see earthworms, which will be an indication that there's life in the soil. So there's a very useful chart. There's a link in the handout that you're going to receive today that describes different amendments, materials that you might use as amendments and what their benefits are, what some of the pros and cons are, along with some notes. So it goes through a nice list of amendments and describes them. So I recommend that it's at the top of the list in the handout that you're going to receive later today. So it's a really great document that talks about amendments. Amending is not the same as mulching. Mulches are applied to the soil surface, and they can reduce evaporation and keep the soil cooler and reduce weed growth. Mulches are not mixed into the soil. So let's summarize what amendments are and what they can provide. Amendments are materials that are mixed into the upper inches of soil. Many things can be amendments: compost, manure, coffee grounds, many different things. And they can modify soil properties. So we talked about drainage, water retention, and helping to form good structure. Those are three ways that amendments can improve physical properties, and they can also help with chemical properties. And as I promised, that's still coming in this presentation. So before I talk about fertilizers, I want to talk about essential plant nutrients. 17 elements are vital to plant growth. This is a bit like the ingredients in a multi-purpose vitamin. Here they are in a list. You don't need to remember these beyond knowing that they're important for plant growth. And plants take in the elements as compounds. They generally don't take them in as individual elements. Nitrate, for example, is a compound which includes nitrogen, and it's one form that the plants are able to absorb. These three nutrients, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are special. Plants take these three nutrients from air and water. Carbon and oxygen enter plants through leaves as carbon dioxide. Oxygen and hydrogen enter plants through roots as water. And oxygen also enters through roots as pure oxygen. So we do not apply fertilizers to provide these three nutrients, but maintaining the pore space in our soil management practices, and making sure that we don't compact the soil will greatly affect their availability. So the next group of 14 in the list, plants take from soil. Top 6 are macronutrients, and the next group are micronutrients. And as you can imagine, the micronutrients are needed in smaller quantities than the macronutrients, but they're all important. They might be needed in very tiny amounts, but they're all essential. And the 3 macronutrients at the top of the list you're going to be hearing a lot about. Nitrogen for strong leaf growth and dark green color, phosphorus for good strong roots and early growth and seed formation, and potassium for plant vigor, disease, and stress resistance. So how do plants obtain those 14 nutrients? Through their roots. One of the roots' critical roles is to take up soil water. If the roots are damaged or drowning in excess water, then the plants will be nutrient deprived. pH is a gatekeeper for nutrients. Even if the nutrients are in the soil, the question is, will they make it to the plant? So what is pH? I'm going to stop for a moment to talk about it because it plays such an important role in the availability of nutrients to plants. pH is a measure of the acidity of the soil on a logarithmic scale that goes from very acidic on one side to basic on the other, and water in the middle is pH neutral. The scale, as I said, is logarithmic, and so coffee is 100 times as acidic as pure water. Saliva is 10 times as acidic as pure water. So why is it important? Well, pH has 2 functions in the soil, biological and chemical. Many organisms live in the soil, and those organisms each have an optimum pH range. Fungi prefer low pH soils, and bacteria prefer more alkaline soils. And near neutral pH, around 7, is where the greatest diversity of organic life in the soil is. The chemical function, on the other hand, is the gatekeeper function that I mentioned for nutrients. This graphic shows the availability of nutrients at different pH values. The wider a bar is, so here let's just take a look at the iron bar. It's wide on the left-hand side, which is the acidic side, and it gets narrow as the pH increases and the soil becomes more basic. So the iron is available in acidic soil and not available in alkaline soil. So what looks like a nutrient deficiency could actually be a pH issue. And extra fertilizer won't be able to fix a problem that's caused by a low or a high pH. For example, a common symptom of high pH is yellowing of new growth due to a lack of available iron. Iron chlorosis frequently occurs in soils that are alkaline, so pH greater than about 7. And this is an example of what that might look like. A lemon tree that has chlorotic leaves, they're yellowing leaves where you can still see the green veins in the leaf. pH varies naturally in soil. Soil is more acidic in the eastern regions of our country where it's forested and there's more rainfall, and it's less acidic, it's more basic as you move into the Midwest and the West. And in the Bay Area, I lightened this plot, so this image of the map, so that you could barely read the city name. So I apologize for the fact that it's very pale, but I wanted you to be able to see where the cities were. So Mount Diablo is right here. You can sort of see it. And what you can tell is that the pH varies across the Bay Area region, but honestly, it's not extreme. So if you take a look at the key, red is acidic and dark blue is very strongly alkaline. And the only extreme colors that are dark red or dark blue, extreme red is up here, Vallejo, Novato, and there's some dark blue around the South Bay. But generally, the paler yellow, the paler pink color here, let's see here. In the Bay Area, it's mostly this pinky color or pale blue, which is neutral or slightly acidic, and only one step away from that. So the pH in the Bay Area is relatively close to neutral. The soil pH is not static. Factors that might cause it to change include natural processes such as rainfall pattern changes or natural weathering of soil particles or decomposition of organic matter, and also human actions. Fertilizing practices, irrigation practices, and amending with liming materials can affect the pH. And also irrigation water might contribute to a higher soil pH. May or may not be a problem, but if you see plant issues, it's a fairly easy thing to test. Litmus paper tests, which are available at a nurseries or online, are somewhat imprecise. They're relatively inexpensive, but they are a quick way to get a sense of what's going on with the pH in your soil. There are some handheld meters that a home gardener can use, and they can range very widely in cost, from $50 up to $500. This range is driven by how precise the results will be. The $50 version is still good. It just is a little bit less precise in the results. These are, as I mentioned, somewhat expensive. They can be difficult to operate, and they're fragile. So there's a sensor in them that has to be kept moist, and if the sensor dries out, then the meter won't work. So they need to be managed and handled a certain way, and they need to be calibrated. There are also some low-cost pH probes that you might be able to find, and they cost in the range of $12 to $20. They're somewhat unreliable, and we don't recommend them. You can also take your soil sample to a commercial lab. This is reliable. It's actually the most expensive if you do it multiple times because you're going to be paying this amount over a number of efforts, and it takes time. If you want to know what the pH of your soil is today, you won't be able to know because you'll take a couple of weeks to get the results back. If you learn as a result of this testing that you need to raise your pH, University of California recommends that you send your sample to a soil test laboratory to get some guidance on how much limestone to apply. And the reason for that is that it's difficult to understand all of the relationships between the limestone in the soil and the texture and the calcium that's existing in the soil. And so it's a good idea to get some guidance. But you can also do it on your own. And there's a link in today's handout titled to a document that's titled Adjusting the Soil pH in Your Garden. And you can use that if you prefer, rather than sending your soil to a laboratory. And if you need to lower the pH, if a home test indicates this, then there are also instructions in the handout that I've listed above. The bottom line is if you want to make it more acidic, you can add sulfur, and if you want to make your soil more alkaline, you can add limestone. And you're going to want to follow the directions on the packages and in that guideline. So let's just summarize what we know. pH will affect the availability of nutrients to plants. The pH in the soil is driven by natural geologic variations, the weather, and the pH and mineral content of your irrigation water. And you can't control these things. You have what you have. The pH in the soil is also driven by how the soil may have been fertilized over many seasons and any amendments that you or others may have added to the soil, and also your irrigation practices. And these are things that you can control going forward, but whatever's been done has already been done. So you have to start at the starting point is where you are right now. So the bottom line here is that modifying pH can take time, and in the end, you might be frustrated with the results. It's a slow process, and the soil tends to keep its own pH, so you might end up being frustrated. But nevertheless, it's good to understand what's going on and what the pH of your soil is. Knowledge is helpful. So before I move on to fertilizers, I want to come back to the soil pie chart for a moment. And for the upcoming slides, keep in mind, soil water is never pure water. It's not drinking water. It's full of dissolved organic and inorganic substances. You might call it a soil soup or a soil solution. Some of that moisture is available to roots immediately, and some of it is held tightly to soil particles and less available to roots. I'll come back to this in a few slides. Okay, I want to move on to fertilizers. Fertilizers improve the availability of nutrients to plants. And those 14 essential nutrients that are supplied by soil can be supplemented with what we provide in the fertilizer. The three numbers on the fertilizer bag on the front usually are N, P, and K. So a 100-pound bag of 12, 12, 12 will have 12 pounds each of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and the remaining 64 pounds are filler. So fertilizers are regulated. I don't know if I said that amendments are not regulated. Fertilizers are, so you can rely on the information that's provided on the fertilizer bag to let you know what it is that you're purchasing. And remember this pie chart and the water. The action in fertilizers is happening in this 25% that's listed as water. Solid particles, both organic material and inorganic material, release nutrients to the soil solution slowly. Soluble ingredients in fertilizers mix into the soil solution immediately. So when I say soluble, I mean materials that are able to be dissolved, in this case, in water. So that's a very quick addition to the soil solution if it's soluble. If it's an insoluble ingredient in the fertilizer, that will require time, temperature, and microorganisms to be added to the soil solution. So here's a collection of fertilizer labels, and we'll look at one of them. And that one is a 651. So that means it has 6% nitrogen, 5% phosphate, and 1% potash. And what you'll see here on the label, you'll see that 1.2% of the nitrogen is water soluble and 4.8% is insoluble. And the potash similarly is soluble, and so it's immediately available. And the phosphate, the fact that it says available here means that the fertilizer contains a necessary phosphate for the plant, and it will be released into the soil solution if the pH is appropriate. Also on the label, you can read what is the source of the ingredients in the fertilizer. So in this case, the nutrients are derived from cottonseed meal, alfalfa meal, steamed bone meal, etc. So it's another important item that's on the label is the source of the ingredient. So that's important to pay attention. So when you're buying fertilizer, you're going to have to make some decisions. And we'll talk about those here. You'll have to, one of them is, will you be purchasing organic or synthetic or chemical fertilizer? There are many successful gardeners who use a combination of both of these. Organic, let's talk about those first. They might be manures, compost, bone meal, and they're derived directly from plant or animal sources. And microorganisms are required for their breakdown, so they're typically slow acting. They're going to feed the microorganisms, and in the process, as we talked about, they're going to help build soil structure. And they may contain many essential nutrients. Some disadvantages to organic fertilizers are that they might be expensive, they might be difficult to source, they might be hard to find, or less available, and they might be smelly. Synthetic fertilizers, on the other hand, can provide the same nutrients, and they're often called commercial or chemical fertilizers because they go through a manufacturing process. They're relatively less expensive, small amounts can provide the necessary nutrients, and they're soluble typically, so their nutrients are available immediately. But it's possible to over-fertilize. And once the nutrients get into the soil, it's difficult or impossible to remove them. And they can also leach into surrounding areas, and they can burn the crops if they're applied incorrectly. And also, if you use a synthetic fertilizer, you're not feeding the life in the soil. So just talk about terminology for a minute. What about the difference between certified organic food and the term organic when it's used in a fertilizer label? Well, organic food products are food that have followed federal guidelines in their processing and planting and growing. So that term means that something for food, and it's quite different than what it means for a fertilizer label. Organic fertilizers are derived from plant or animal sources, and examples are manures, compost, or bone meal. So another category that you'll have to think about when you're purchasing fertilizer is fast-acting versus slow-acting. Organic fertilizers are typically slow-acting because it takes time for the microorganisms to break them down. And synthetic fertilizers are typically fast-acting because they're immediately soluble, but they can be slow-acting if they're made with some kind of a means to slow down their dissolution into water. So for example, those small pellets that you can purchase that have a coating on the outside, that coating might be made of a polymer or it might be a clay, and that coating is designed to break down slowly over a season or several months, and that creates a means for the synthetic fertilizer, the chemical fertilizer, to be slow acting. Another decision you'll have to make, do you want a complete or an incomplete fertilizer? So a complete fertilizer just means that it contains some of all three of N, P, and K. And incomplete means that it may contain just one or two of them. So for example, perhaps you want to add nitrogen to your soil because of a plant that needs nitrogen, but you don't need P and K. So that would be an incomplete fertilizer that just included one of them, nitrogen. Another decision you have to make is whether you want to have dry versus liquid. Dry is cost effective. It might be granules, powders, or pellets. And liquid is convenient and typically a little bit more expensive. And there are products that both amend and fertilize. So manure contains several essential nutrients. It supplies organic matter, and it requires caution, as I mentioned earlier. In this case, the horse manure is mixed with bedding straw, and that manure will have varying nutrient content depending on the animal it came from, what that animal ate, and for how long the manure was stored. Because of some potential problems with excess phosphorus, we recommend the use of manure only every other year. And remember, and compost also is a product that can both amend and fertilize. And both of these will provide good qualities to the soil. They'll improve soil aeration. water retention, water infiltration, and nutrient holding capacities. So nutrients can also be provided by healthy living soil. The organic material slice in this pie has an enormous effect on almost all soil properties. And that organic matter in soil consists of two parts, the part that is not alive and the part that is alive. The part that is not alive can be thought of as the active material that might be recently deceased organisms, old plant roots, litter, manures. And what's really important here is that these are the main supply of food for the organisms that are living in the soil. And the other portion of the part that's not alive is the stable organic matter. We refer to this sometimes as humus, and this is well decomposed. It's very stable. It's still decomposing, but it's very slow. And what about the portion of that organic material piece of the pie that is alive? Well, that's a sliver, as you can see here. It's between 5 and 15% of this green section of organic material. And it's tiny, but it plays a very large role in the health of plants. And perhaps you saw a presentation last month in this library Master Gardener series titled The Universe Beneath Your Feet. If you haven't had a chance to see that, I encourage you to do so. It's available both at the Master Gardener website and at the library website. So that video talks about all of the things that are living in the soil. I want to just talk briefly about one of them, the mycorrhizal fungi, because they're so important to plants. 90% of plants evolved to form relationships with these fungi. You've probably seen these white filaments in your garden growing on decaying wood or mulch. These threads are called hyphae, and they're very common. They grow in and around roots, and they form networks. And a network of hyphae is called a mycelium, and these networks help the plants acquire nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, and micronutrients, and also water from the soil. And in exchange, the fungus receives a place to live and carbon compounds for its own growth. And the term mycorrhizae actually refers to the relationship between the root and the fungus. So myco is fungus and rhizae is root. So it is a description of the relationship. There are many positive impacts of mycorrhizae. They extend the plant root zone farther and into tinier spaces so they are able to reach nutrients and moisture where the roots themselves are not able to do that. They can improve both the availability and the intake of some nutrients, especially phosphorus, and they can improve a plant's resistance to pathogens, and also they can improve the surrounding soil. In this, they provide some of that sticky material that I talked about at the beginning that helps to clump the aggregates together and to form the soil particles into aggregates. And there are a number of studies that have shown that fungal threads help bring water and nutrition into the plant, and that when mycorrhizae are present, plants are less susceptible to water stress. So this is very important in California as we face continuing drought. So what's the connection between mycorrhizae and fertilizers? Well, it's possible for plants to become dependent on fertilizers in the absence of healthy soil that includes the mycorrhizae. And there are studies that suggest that the fungus-host-plant relationship is mutualistic or symbiotic only if the plant is somewhat starved of nutrients. That relationship forms if the plant is looking for those nutrients, and if they're easy to find because they've been provided with fertilizers, the relationship with the mycorrhizae is less likely to develop. There are plants that don't form these associations. Most plants in the brassica family, so that's mustards, cabbage, broccoli, do not form mycorrhizae. And in fact, the roots of brassicas contain chemicals that are potentially toxic to many soil fungi. And also stone crops and proteas are examples of plants that don't usually form mycorrhizal relationships. and legumes only form limited associations with mycorrhizal fungi, legumes such as beans, peas, and lupin. So you might be asking, should I add mycorrhizal fungi to my soil? You've seen that it's available in packets in the nursery. Should you buy them and add them to your soil? Well, the jury's still out. There are some resources that say no, since the mycorrhizal fungi are naturally distributed in soil, and there are some that say yes, it is helpful. Mycorrhizal spores lie dormant in organic matter near the soil surface and in the soil. And whether or not adding mycorrhizal fungi inoculant whether or not it makes a positive difference is an open question. But in any case, what can you do to protect the fungi that are in your own backyard? Avoid tilling the soil. Apply fertilizer only when it's needed. If soil tests indicate a nutrient deficiency, and that's the moment when you want to apply fertilizer. And apply chicken or steer manure, as I mentioned, only every other year. And also be cautious with soil-drenched fungicides and foliar non-systemic fungicides. Always follow the package directions. So soil management practices such as tilling and application of fertilizers can make a big difference in whether or not the mycorrhizae will thrive in your garden. So in summary, nearly all plants benefit from these relationships. The fungi either surround or penetrate the roots, and they can reach out farther and into tinier spaces than the roots, and thereby locate nutrients and moisture when plant roots cannot. So you want to encourage the growth of the fungi and the development of these associations. So now I want to talk about an action plan for your own garden. I mentioned soil testing, and you can, of course, also obtain a commercial soil test to evaluate the nutrients in your soil. This image is an example of data from a commercial test for my own garden a few years ago. So when would you want to consider getting a commercial soil test? Well, if you have a new landscape and you want to understand what's going in the soil in a new area that you're developing in your garden, or maybe you suspect a nutrient deficiency. When would you do this? Any time of year. However, wait a month or two after applying amendment or fertilizer and avoid extremely wet conditions. You don't want to be digging in the soil when it's very wet. That's damaging to the soil structure in any case. And how frequently would you get a soil test? Well, if the results from a previous test indicate that your pH and nutrient levels are fine, then you don't need to do this every year. However, if changes are needed and recommended, then you're going to want to do it every year until you're satisfied with the status of your soil. And in general, in sandy soils, you want to test it every 2 to 3 years, and clay soils every 3 to 4 years. And there are a couple of things to note. One of them is that when you're selecting a lab to perform a soil test, confirm that the lab will give you some guidance. They won't just give you the data without giving you some suggestions about what to do with that data and how to improve the nutrients in your soil or the pH. And also use the same lab each time you test so that it's easy to compare results over time, because you may be doing this every few years and you're going to want to be able to go back and look at what was done before. And it's much easier if you have the results in the same format. And what will you do with those results? If it turns out, for example, that you need a single nutrient like nitrogen, you might want to apply a fertilizer that contains only nitrogen. So here are some examples: blood meal, fish meal, and soybean meal. And you can see that the first number in every case is the high number. So these are incomplete, in the case of these two fertilizers, that contain nitrogen. These are organic examples, but there are also, you can certainly purchase synthetic fertilizers containing nitrogen, either ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate. So I should have mentioned earlier, but I'm going to mention now, that I have these images in the slides, but University of California does not recommend or endorse any particular products. These images are here as examples only. So what about landscape plants, trees, shrubs, and perennials? So if you have a new landscape, then take a look and evaluate. Test for nutrients and pH, and amend the soil, especially if it looks compacted and does not appear fertile. Then incorporate 3 inches of compost and mix it into the top 6 to 12 inches of soil. One time only. Remember, we want to till or mechanically turn the soil as little as possible, but the first time you're looking at an area, you might need to do that. And address the pH at the same time if your soil test indicates that that's necessary. University of California does not recommend amending holes for planting individual trees, shrubs, or vines. And the reason for that is it's good to amend an entire area, but if you're just digging an individual hole for a tree or a shrub, then what you want to do is replace the soil back in that you removed. So put back the native soil. You don't want to have a boundary condition where inside the hole you have very amended, nice, soft soil, and then outside that boundary condition at the edge of the hole, it goes back to native soil. The roots are going to have a hard time penetrating into the native soil if they got used to that nice, cushy situation in the hole. So UC does not recommend amending individual holes. What about young plants? You want to fertilize trees and woody shrubs with nitrogen for up to 2 years after planting at the drip line, which is at the edges of where the twigs are, and use a slow release fertilizer and follow the directions. Non-flowering trees and shrubs don't require fertilizer even at planting. And fruit trees, fertilizer is not necessary the first year. Perennials should have a slow release fertilizer in the planting hole. Now let's say you have an existing landscape and you want to know how to manage an existing landscape. First of all, do not amend it. Amending should only occur once before planting. What about fertilizer? Landscape trees and shrubs, mature trees and shrubs, do not need fertilizer if they look healthy. Fruit trees should be fertilized. You want to apply nitrogen annually during the growing season in spring or split between spring and just after harvest at the drip line. And be careful, again, too much nitrogen can cause softer fruit, poor fruit color, and reduce storage and shelf life, and also increase problems with pests. So follow the package directions. If nutrient deficiencies are suspected, follow the University of California guidelines. Again, there's a link in the handout. Perennials should be fertilized when growth begins in the spring. And ideally, you'll top dress the garden with compost annually, so not near the stem or the trunk. Let's support the soil with good, healthy organic material. So what about annual plants such as flowers and vegetables? So for new beds, incorporate 3 inches of compost into the top 6 to 10 inches of soil and add a slow release fertilizer as needed based on the soil test results. For existing beds in a no-till situation, add a slow release fertilizer as needed and follow the package directions and apply a layer of compost 1 to 2 inches deep. When do you want to do this? When you're replanting those annual beds, and this could be several times a year. Also, if you're planting a vegetable bed and the bed is going to be bare for a season, maybe right now you're pulling out your tomato plants and your other summer vegetables and you're ready to just take a rest for the season, it's really a good idea to put a cover crop in to provide some organisms that are some roots that are living in the soil, and also some biomass, some good healthy biomass in the soil. So cover crops are a really good idea. There are some more specifics for annuals and vegetable beds, and actually for all of the action plans in the handout. What about California natives? They can be tricky. They need some special consideration. And as with all plants, right place, right plant, right place. Don't amend the soil for natives. In general, they don't want to have amended soil. They want native soil, and they don't want fertilizer. Fertilizer is not needed or even desirable for native plants. If the soil is very sandy and the native is not a beach plant, then you might want to add some organic matter, some compost, just in case, just to provide some organic material into that sandy soil. What about container gardens? So containers, nutrients will leach out of the soil with every watering. So those nutrients will need to be replaced on a regular basis. If you have a heavy feeder, so here's a tomato plant in a pot. A tomato is a heavy feeder. Give a light dose of a water-soluble fertilizer every few weeks, and include a slow-release dry fertilizer in the soil. And if you have a light feeder in that container, then include a slow-release dry fertilizer in the soil also. There are many potting mixes with fertilizers that are already in them, so read the package that when you purchase the potting mix so that you're not over-fertilizing. You don't want to overdo it. And in general, you need to be cautious with fertilizers. More fertilizer is not better. So if plant needs are met with fertilizer, they won't form those mycorrhizal relationships with the fungi that we talked about. So that's one important consideration. Another is that too much fertilizer can burn the plant roots. It can encourage lush growth, and that lush growth, it looks great, right? It's a lot of green growth, but it will attract pests, and you may be producing a lot of growth at the expense, perhaps, of your tomato fruit. It can also lead to a higher water demand because all that lush growth needs water. So in a drought situation, you definitely don't want to have excess soluble fertilizer. In addition, there are environmental costs associated with fertilizers, and these can be significant. Making nitrogen fertilizer takes a lot of energy, and there are even some organic fertilizers that can have a negative environmental impact, such as kelp fertilizers. I'm going to move on to some solutions you may have heard about in your gardening experience, in your gardening world. So you may have heard, for example, of coffee grounds. What about coffee grounds? Well, they can be a source of nitrogen, large quantities that you might get from a local Starbucks or Pete's. If you dump them all in one place, that could cause a problem. So, everything in moderation. But coffee grounds can be a good source of nitrogen. And I, for example, add them into my compost pile. I don't put them on the garden bed directly. What about wood ashes to raise the pH? Well, excess ashes can cause both high pH and salinity, so we don't recommend them. What about Epsom salts? They can provide magnesium and sulfur, which could be a good thing, but they're soluble and they dissipate in soil that receives regular irrigation. They can easily the calcium that's available to plants. We don't recommend Epsom salts. What about compost teas? Well, they can be beneficial. However, as a source of nutrients, it's hard to know exactly what your plants are getting. And since the tea will have dissolved nutrients, it's possible to provide more than is needed. Use sparingly. So I would say, just be careful. What about buried banana peels? Well, these can provide potassium, but again, nitrogen is going to be needed to break down the peel, and that will mean less nitrogen is available for the plant. So you might instead want to add the banana peel to the compost pile. And what about eggshells? Well, I would say eggshells are neither good nor bad. Unless the eggshells are ground into a very fine powder, the calcium will use, but they won't hurt either. The conclusion to be reached here is that you can be open to gardening wisdom, but also use common sense and confirm that any advice that you've heard can be corroborated by academic sources or scientific papers. So in summary, our job as gardeners is to nurture the conditions in the soil. We want both the plants and the organisms living in the soil to thrive. And this can be accomplished by disturbing the soil as little as possible, using amendments and fertilizers carefully, and applying compost every season. So thank you for sticking with me. I covered a great deal of material tonight. I hope that you find it helpful. Happy gardening.